Our reading today will be slightly different than what's listed in your bulletin. We'll be reading from Acts chapter 16, verses 16 to 34. One day, as we were going to the place of prayer, we met a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners a great deal of money by fortune-telling. While she followed Paul and us, she would cry out, "These men are slaves of the Most High God, who proclaim to you a way of salvation." She kept doing this for many days. But Paul, very much annoyed, turned and said to the spirit, "I order you, in the name of Jesus Christ, to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. But when her owners saw that their hope of making money was gone, they seized Paul and Silas and dragged them into the marketplace before the authorities. When they had brought before the magistrates, they said, "These men are disturbing our city. They are Jews and are advocating customs that are not lawful for us as Romans to adopt or observe." The crowd joined in attacking them, and the magistrates had them stripped of their clothing and ordered them to be beaten with rods. After they had given them a severe flogging, they threw them into prison and ordered the jailer to keep them securely. Following these instructions, he put them in the innermost cell and fastened their feet in stocks. About midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to them. Suddenly, there was an earthquake, so violent that the foundations of the prison were shaken, and immediately all the doors were opened and everyone's chains were unfastened. When the jailer woke up and saw the prison doors open wide, he drew his sword and was about to kill himself, since he supposed that the prisoners had escaped. But Paul shouted in a loud voice, "Do not harm yourself, for we are all here." The jailer called for lights, and rushing in, he fell down, trembling before Paul and Silas. Then he brought them outside and said, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They answered, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." They spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all who were in his house. At the same hour of the night, he took them and washed their wounds. Then he and his entire family were baptized without delay. He brought them up into the house and set food before them, and he and his entire household rejoiced that he had become a believer in God. The word of God for the people of God.
And thanks, Paul, and to the bell choir. That was just a moving piece. I'm becoming really used to the fact that the scripture always follows the music, because if you saw me up here, I'm crying all the time, and it takes me a little bit to get composed. And what I love about that is that the love that is shared by our musicians in our church, that share that love with all of us. It's a gift of their time, but if you are up here where I see them, you see the love that just radiates out of them, and that's what makes the music special. You know, we've been talking about love as our witness, and this is just one of thousands of ways that we show our love for the people in the communities that we're a part of. It's an amazing thing that God's entrusted us to love the world. Believe me, I think God could find better representatives than me. Let me be really clear about that. And yet God has entrusted us with this great message. But you know, I'm thinking about a lot of this whole thing of love as our witness, and we really like the love part of that sentence. How many of us like the witness part? The like talking about our faith, actually putting something out. It's a lot better when we're like, oh, I'm a person of action, right? Just watch the way I live, and that's gonna be great. But I was thinking about the other day, like with Thanksgiving coming up, like what's the two things you're not allowed to talk about at the Thanksgiving table? One is politics and religion, right? How many of you have that rule? Politics and religion? Oh, apparently only these folks. All the rest of you have functional families? Okay. But honestly, how many of you, as you're thinking about Thanksgiving, are all of a sudden thinking about managing all those relationships of all those personalities in one place? And you sort of know how people fall on various divides on all sorts of things, and you're thinking, how am I gonna, coach Uncle Charlie from talking about his favorite pet project or about this particular political point of view, and God forbid that we should get on religions of the world or even different expressions of Christian faith. People get really mad at each other, and most of us want to have a peaceful and loving time. And so I think as a result, many of us experiences like these and many others, we're kind of gun shy, to be honest, about sharing our faith with other people, aren't we? We're kind of afraid that maybe we won't have the right things to say. We'll blow it that way. Sometimes we're a little embarrassed and we don't want to be branded in a certain way. How many of you have thought to yourself as you've heard stories of Christians all over the world or in the United States or the way they express themselves, you think, I don't want to be affiliated with those kind of people, right? You don't want to, or how many times have you said, well, we're not that kind of Christian? How many of you have ever said, well, we're not that kind of church? Yeah, we're a different kind of church, right? We have our own flavor, but what we're really saying is we've got our little our world carved out for us, and please don't put us in that big bunch. But then sometimes some of us are like, well, if you really saw how messy my life is, you might notice a huge gap between what I say or what I do on Sunday morning and how I'm kind of living my life. And frankly, I don't want to share anything about my faith because it's just inconsistent. It's messy underneath. Well, what I love about this story that we read about Paul is that Paul and Silas and his whole entourage in the book of Acts have been traveling around, and they're now in a little city called Philippi. They've had some success down at the river. They've got some of the women gathered together in a place of prayer, and some people have actually come to faith. But there seems to be, Paul's, trying to control this message in the earlier days, and there seems to be this slave girl that's following him around who's actually stealing the message from Paul. Imagine that you really, you're at that family gathering and somebody says something about God and you're wanting to say something loving and inclusive and somebody hijacks the conversation and you're like, oh, that was the worst thing you could have ever said. They'll never, ever want to talk about faith or things that are important again. Well, that slave woman was doing just that thing. She was running around and she co-opted Paul's message. And she said, hey, these guys are, servants of the God of Most High, and Paul does it not out of compassion and not out of a sense of justice. He's not fighting for her right to be freed from her slave owners. He's not saying, oh, she's this poor, suffering person. It says he was annoyed. And the word is almost like he swats her like a gnat. Like, oh, be gone, you stupid evil spirit. I'm done with you. Goodbye. Kind of just really flippantly. And I love the fact that Paul in this case is not the exemplary person of great love and compassion. He's just like all the enough. He's like, enough is enough. Get out of my face and be done with it all. Now, if the story ended there, it might feel a little differently, but Paul in that sets up a whole series of events because of that action. And as Andrew read, God forbid that we would ever do something that could be construed as good, and the next thing we know, we have a mob around us, yelling at us, accusing us. And not only that, the police show up, and then they start authorizing us to be stripped and beaten right in a sort of a mob violence mentality. And then before we've even had a chance to explain ourselves, we're carted off to jail. And that's exactly what happens to Paul and Silas. Now, if you know the story, you know that later on in the story, Paul actually appeals to the governing forces and says, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. You weren't supposed to beat me or treat me like that because I'm a Roman citizen. Now, I'm quite sure that if he'd had the opportunity, he would have mentioned that a little earlier in the encounter, right? Why would somebody fail to mention, as their clothes are being stripped off of them, as they're being beaten almost to the point of death, that, hey, we could have avoided this whole thing if I just let it slip that I was a Roman citizen? Which tells me that mob and that whole sort of kangaroo court that happens out on the street happened so fast that they had no chance to even defend themselves. I was recently in Jerusalem, as you know, and I had the opportunity to do something I'd never done before, which was go into the ancient fortress that surrounded Jerusalem, which is a Roman prison. I'd been in other prisons, in sort of the religious prisons in Jerusalem, but I'd never been in the Roman one, and I was really astonished at what they call the prison of Christ. And this is just this one little spot that they believe that Jesus was actually probably incarcerated on the night of his trial and all that stuff when he's bouncing back between all these different courts. And it really surprised me to see how the Romans took care of their prisoners. So when you walk in, first of all, you see the places where the feet are shackled and the arms are shackled. But the thing that was interesting about that is that there's like a stone bench, and in the middle are 2 holes. And so when they incarcerate a prisoner, they don't allow them to sit. They have to stand, and they put one leg into one hole and one leg into the other hole. Your feet are chained and your arms are chained. You can't move. You can't squat. You can't get any relief. And this was a common practice in Roman times. And I'm not really sure whether that jail in Philippi was exactly configured that way, but I do know that when you were placed in a Roman dungeon, it was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be painful. In fact, in most cases, if you found yourself in a Roman jail, it was just assured that a death sentence was coming your way. They were just holding on to you long enough before they could bring in the executioners. If you were lucky, you might get a trial. But more than likely, whatever had started outside the jail with the mob violence was going to end in your death. And I can't imagine that evening that as Paul and Silas, stripped and beaten and immobilized in a very humiliating and painful way, why on earth were they singing? Why were they singing hymns to God? You see, that's something about love that they had in action. They knew that something else could or was possible, even in the midst of this incredible suffering. It says in the text that the other prisoners were listening. And maybe in that moment, Paul and Silas just knew that the way that they behaved in that moment would have an impact on those around them. Little did they know the story that was about to unfold. And they found themselves singing praises and celebrating somehow in that moment, instead of focusing on the injustice that they had experienced and the wounds that they now needed so desperately to tend. And really, love as their witness was an incredible moment late at night in that prison, as they would not let injustice and suffering defeat them, but instead turned their eyes towards God. You see, it was a messy situation. All of the people around them thought they were justified in having them in jail. They didn't have a whole lot of advocates standing around going, oh, this is unfair. There might have just been a small group of women who had perhaps gathered at the prayer place earlier in Philippi, but they had no national church before them. They really had nothing going for them except their desire to somehow bear witness to God's great grace, even in the midst of tremendous suffering and injustice. You know, Paul, a long time ago, realized in his life, as it says in Acts, that being a perfect person didn't really work for him. And he wasn't really looking for the perfect opportunity or even wanting to say the perfect words. He just let God speak through him in those ordinary, messy, unjust, unfair times of his life. And as the story goes, it was remarkable. Because then when an earthquake comes and their chains are loosened, they don't leave and the doors are opened. We have other stories in the book of Acts where that happens, and Peter sees that as his invitation to leave the prison, but in this case, they don't. And the jailer, who knows that if he shows up the next day without these prisoners, it will be his life, goes to take his own life rather than be tortured by his Roman overlords, hears them call out from inside the prison saying they're all there. You see, it wasn't only the hymns that they sang to God, but the concern that they had for others that was so overwhelming that this jailer falls at the feet of Paul and says, "What do I need to do to be saved?" And out of that, this jailer, his family, and of course the community around them is just astonished by the graciousness and love that Paul extends to them. You see, I believe that Paul, from the very beginnings of his ministry, believed one thing, and that drove him to be the evangelist that he was, to found all those churches. It was the reason why, even in the midst of great suffering, he could sing. And that was because he himself had experienced mercy and grace, unexpected, undeserved, and he believed that every person he encountered, everyone, could receive that same grace too. So when we think about love as our witness and about sharing our faith, you see, part of this is the challenge of us moving into those spaces and being willing to have the courage to share our own experiences of God's love and unexpected mercy in ways that are true to us and bear witness to the love of God. Now, I have to say, I've been thinking about this because I'm thinking about, I promised in the Beacon this week I'd tell you some unusual stories. So I'm going to tell you a story about a woman named Esther I know. Esther was one of the women in my Berkeley church, and Berkeley was an urban church surrounded by a college campus, but in an urban area. And Esther was on her way to church one Sunday morning, parking her car on one of those city streets. Esther was a woman who was late 70s, early 80s in the life of our church. And as she got out of her car, she was carjacked at knife point. You know, it happened all so fast that nobody was around to see this happen. We only found out about it later, and of course we were all horrified because of all the people in the world, you couldn't have gotten a nicer person than Esther. And all I could think of was, oh, poor Esther. Here she was a single woman, she had never married, she was a school teacher in life, she led a very simple life. She was the dearest, sweetest person, and I couldn't imagine the horror of what it was like for her to be carjacked at knife point. A horrible, horrible experience. But Esther tells the story that they started driving around because the guy took her at knife point and took her to her ATM and said, hey, give me your money. You know, I want, back in those days, maybe you got $200 or $300 out, you know? But Esther, being Esther, started reprimanding this young man. What do you think you're doing? What has happened in your life that you think you should, you know, steal my car and steal from me? And he starts talking about his little bit of his life, and you can tell she said he was a little apologetic for having kidnapped this old lady, but I guess that was all that he had as option that day. And they go to the ATM, and she takes out the money, and she's still at knife point, and they're driving around, and she starts saying, you know, you're better than this. You're better than this. You don't have to do this. And well, anyway, to make a long story short, by the time they end up back at the church, where they dropped her off, so she didn't go to the early service. She ended up going to the late service that day. He in the thing says, you know what? Let me give you all your money back, but if I could take a 20, that would help me get some food. And she said, if that's all you needed, you just should have asked me at the very beginning. And then she said to him, but I want to tell you, I'm going to pray for you. She said, I am going to call the police, but I am going to pray for you. And eventually, Esther, he was arrested. He was eventually given a probation sentence, and she went to his trial and testified for him and also against him in the same moment. And when we asked Esther, like, I said, were you scared? She goes, oh, I was. That man had a knife on me. But she said, I knew God was with me. And I thought, well, I guess I'm supposed to share something of God's love with him because he certainly hasn't had any bit of it his whole life. And later I said, well, weren't you bitter about this? And she goes, well, if it wasn't me, it would have been somebody else. Why not me? I think about that ability to sort of share your faith in whatever circumstances, and please, I hope none of you ever are carjacked, all right? And that becomes the test. But sometimes God gives us unexpected times to share our faith. And in that case, not unlike Paul, it was a situation that Esther could never have imagined. And yet she was open and willing to share her faith. But what happens when the story is really about the person who shares faith and they were the cause of hurt and injustice? How does that work when you're supposed to be called to share your faith? And I'm going to tell you a story about me. So think about, this is almost 20 years ago, right after 9/11, and the week after 9/11. And if you remember that time, the country was sort of on edge, weren't they? Right? The planes weren't flying at that point, and I had been a little unsettled by this whole thing, and I had already been in one car accident like 3 days after 9/11, and so I was driving a rental car, and on this particular Saturday, I happened to have a load that I couldn't believe. And just for some context, I'd only been a pastor at this point maybe for 3 months. I was brand new to the pastorate. I was very green in my ministry. And so I foolishly decided on this one Saturday to overload my schedule. And so I did 2 memorial services. I did a graveside service up in Napa, which was 60 miles away, and only to come back and perform a communion service for a retreat of 100 people. And at about 3:45, I was finally heading home, and I was so exhausted. And I thought, oh, so glad this day's over. I need to get home, put my feet up, get ready for Sunday. Except that I turned left in front of a car. And that car T-boned me. It was my fault. I was just exhausted. I hadn't noticed that the green arrow had gone away, and it was now just green, and I needed to yield to the traffic. And you know what? I was really angry. I got out of the car, the woman got out of the car, and oh, it was not a pretty sight. You know that adrenaline rush that happens and everybody's defensive and you're not really sure what happened and you're scared half out of your wits, and that's how I felt. And we sort of looked at each other. It was early days of cell phone. One of us called, some of the people stopped around us, and the witnesses were saying, it's all your fault, it's all your fault. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this. And I went over, and I don't know if you've ever been in an accident, but people tend to separate into corners, almost like a boxing ring, right? You have your corner, I have mine, and I went over, and I'm like, God, honestly, seriously, look at all the good I've done for you today, and you let this happen, you know? And I'm just so upset, and that adrenaline rush then floods, as often happens physiologically, and then I came off that, and I went, whew. And I looked over at that woman, and I'm like, I don't like her. And then I thought, she isn't really responsible, is she? And then I felt this nudge within my spirit where God was saying, go talk to her. I'm like, I am not going to go talk to her. No, I'm not going to talk to her. No, I'm not going to talk to her. Don't you know the rules of the whole game, God? She stands over there, I stand over there, and we wait for the police to come. Nudge, nudge, nudge. Hi. I just want to say, I'm sure when you started off in your day, you did not expect that you were going to end up in a traffic accident. I'm so sorry. Why do you think this had to happen? I'm going back to my corner, thank you very much. I said, I don't know, I'm really sorry, I don't know. And she said, I think it's because God is judging me. What? I just turned left because I was really tired and I wasn't paying attention. I don't know that God was looking up from heaven and going, Debbie, turn in front of this woman so this woman can be judged by God. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I don't, what do you mean? She goes, I have done some horrible things in my life. I think this is God's judgment of me. And I said, oh. I said, you know what? The God that I believe in, and I don't know what your tradition is, I just believe God is a God of love and would never judge you that way. Really, she said. And we started then on one of the most profound spiritual conversations I've ever had at an accident scene in my life. Turns out she had recently become a Christian. She was a foreign-born student at Cal, a graduate student. And we started talking about this nature of grace. Now, remember, she doesn't know what I do. She's never met me before. I've never met her before. And she starts to sort of get teary as she's telling me about all these horrible things she's done in her life and how this has to be God's judgment. And I'm assuring her that the God I know and believe in would never be this way. Now, as we're having this intense conversation, imagine that the police with their lights have shown up. And they're now taking our statements in between this conversation. They've taken statements from the witnesses and they come over and the police officer is now saying, I really probably need you guys to sign some paperwork. And she's crying and I'm crying. And I had just said to her, would you like me to pray for you? And then she turned to the cop and said, do you want to join us? The police officer just looked and said, this is unbelievable. And he said, no, I'll stand back while you guys take care of your business. And we did. We prayed together on the spot. When I said to her, if you want to talk more, that's when I outed myself as a pastor and said, here's my card. And Paula began coming to my church because she lived around the corner from the church. Said she'd seen the church, never walked in. See, those are those kind of unexpected encounters that we have. it could not have been a messier, more embarrassing, a crazy moment for me to think that that was God's invitation to share faith with someone. But all it was paying attention to something she said and then responding. I wasn't trying to convince her to come to church. I just was sort of following up on the statement of something about God hating her or judging her. And then a story unfolded and a conversation that went so deep. You know, when we think about the witness part of love as our witness, it says in 1 Peter that we're supposed to be able to give an answer for the hope that we have experienced. All of us should be open and pray about being open to having these conversations wherever they show up and however they unfold. And that would be the first thing I would say. Just pray. Just be open. I don't want you to go out of here with a list of 5 people that you're going to target to go share your faith. All that makes them as an object. But if you're open and say, if God brings up a conversation or with somebody that somehow we can talk about things that matter, and you're willing to sort of listen and attend to that and follow up, what a great gift, a surprising, astonishing gift a conversation like that can be. So first, pray to just be open. Secondly, be attentive and then sort of follow up. Listen to what people are saying. Be willing just to ask a little bit more. I love saying things like, tell me a little bit more about that. Well, you know, if somebody tells me their kids go to a certain kind of school, I want to know a little bit more about that. If it's a Catholic or religious school, just ask them why. Asking somebody about the things that they care about, or are they doing, even in our holiday stuff, what would be a great question to ask that opens up a spiritual conversation? Are you and your family doing anything to help serve the poor this Christmas? You know, that's not a loaded question, is it? I'm just curious, a lot of families do things at the holidays to help other people. Are you and your family doing anything this year? Could you imagine having a simple, open conversation like that with someone? That's all it takes. It's not like, do you believe in God and you're going to hell? No, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about a normal, everyday conversation about the things that you know people care about and the things that you care about. And then to simply share your experiences. Somebody talks about what they're doing, how natural it would be for you to say, hey, I'm coming to the Alternative Gift Fair. We have this thing going on in our church that helps groups around the world. Would you be interested? Or, wow, when we're talking, you mentioned that you didn't have any family this Christmas that you were hanging out with. Would you want to join mine? Or, wow, it sounds like there's a whole lot of stuff going on in your family. You mentioned that, like, your mother's sick or your sister's ill or there's some challenges going on. I'm just wondering, would you want to have coffee sometime and just talk about those things that are really concerning you? It's just about caring, leaning in, following up, sharing your experiences, and then being open to invite and welcome people into your life. When we started this series on Love as Our Witness, Ashley talked about that great crowd of witnesses that's cheering you on. You don't do this alone. Not only do you have the saints through the ages, but you have all of us. When you leave this place, you carry every person in this community with you. And we're all cheering and rooting and praying for you as you find yourself in sometimes those intersections you didn't expect. But we also talked about last week the difference between hospitality and entertaining, and being open, of an open heart and a welcoming of people. That's the love aspect of being a witness. And today I hope you'll be inspired to think about actually adding a few words, and maybe looking for an opportunity to not only demonstrate, but to actually share with words your experience of God's love and mercy. What a great holiday it'll be as we share those stories with one another. Let's let love be our true and full and complete witness to the gospel of the hope that we have experienced. Amen.